Hello YouTube, welcome back. Can you tell what time of year it is? Up here in the Northern Rivers, as Christmas approaches, we thankfully don't get the cheesy music in all the shops that you tend to get in the big cities. And here on Friday Hut Road, they have a special Santa Claus lane where you can drive along the stretch of Friday Hut Road between Bangalow Road and heading north, and there's a chart up saying, you know, for the kids, you can spot this many dwarves, this many elves, this many candy canes, and they've got a count. And you can drive along Friday Hut Road and count them all, and that'll keep the kids quiet for a while. But it's one of those little community measures that Bruce Chester was talking about in his episode 16 of the Macadamia show. There is that sense of community here that certainly isn't super commercialised, but is happy to celebrate the spirit of Christmas. And if you come for a drive up Friday Hut Road, just a warning in advance, if you're not Santa with a sleigh, then you probably need a car that can deal with a few potholes, because despite being one of the most expensive roads in the Northern Rivers, Friday Hut Road is not the world's best road. And up here we've got Santa Claus on a surfboard, which of course we do, it's the Northern Rivers. Anyway, on with the show. Back here at Nutkin Farm, I'm wandering down the water channel between blocks 2 and 3 on my property, and this time yesterday the grass here was about 3 foot high, and you can see the rough job that the slasher has done. It's a very good job. It really cut through that grass beautifully, basically bowling it over. And you can see in some of the adjoining rows of the trees all the weeds and stuff that are built up, so we're going to probably have to use the slasher to get those down as well. Now, if I have any Queensland subscribers, they're probably switching off right now going, yeah, look at this poser. He's boasting that he's had enough rain to grow grass. And if you wonder what that means, it's interesting to have a look at, you know, how El Nino has affected the macadamia growing districts in Australia so far. And I've looked up the BOM and the Bureau of Meteorology for those overseas, and they've put out statistics on all the major growing regions, and it's just a matter of researching them and looking them up. There's some nice nuts. Rosebank, funnily enough, tops the list of all the macadamia growing districts in Australia. As at the end of November, we'd had 1,207 millimetres of rain. That might sound like a lot to some people, but our average here is just under 2,000, and 1,200 is a dryish year. By comparison, the year 2019, where we were really afraid that the trees would just abort their crop from a lack of water, we got about 880 millimetres that year, and that was close to a record low. What about the other areas? Well, Dunoon came in at 1,082, Alstonville 937, and look, under 1,000 millimetres is really pretty marginal as far as trees putting a crop on is concerned. After a wet year, they'll still do it, but they may actually suffer consequences the following year if the trees overstress themselves and feel like taking a little bit of a holiday on you. Lismore 802. But look, New South Wales is all in a fairly good position when you look north up at the Queensland growing area, where most of Australia's macadamias are now grown. The Glasshouse Mountains has only had 614 millimetres till the end of November this year. Bundaberg 493. And that's just way too low for macadamias. Now, there's a couple of ripples to that, and one is most of the farms in Bundaberg are irrigated. On an average year, they get about 1,000 millimetres of rain anyway, and they tend to supplement that with irrigation, because 1,000 isn't really optimal if you're going to get a good big nut. And so when you halve that and you sort of try and factor into the equation that irrigation can make up some of the difference, It's probably not enough to make up from 493 millimetres unless you've got massive, massive water licences that are more than you'd normally need. Irrigation is really a method of top-up. It's not meant to be the main source of moisture for a macadamia tree. They just use too much water as a crop. You know, they're measured between 50 and 70 litres of water per day per adult macadamia tree, and you just can't use irrigation to give them that much. It would cost you too much as an input for starters, but also in terms of government licensing. You know, it's not the kind of crop where you can rely totally on irrigation if the rain doesn't fall. So it's concerning, definitely concerning in Bundaberg, in that area, if they've only had 493 mils of rain. But look, it could change overnight, and by the time this video comes out, we'll know whether the cyclone bearing down on Australia's coast is going to change that rainfall outcome dramatically in December. Any macadamia farmer will tell you that a cyclone isn't the best way of getting your precipitation, because you might lose your trees and your crop along with it. However, let's hope for them and see if they can get a little bit more rain before the end of December, which is when the nuts stop getting bigger and just start ripening up for harvest. Here's an A16 in block 3, and the nuts are really quite healthy and blemish free at the moment, and there's a fair few of them. The 344s at the top of the block aren't doing well, again, as far as I can tell, although it's very hard to see because they're big and tall. Down near the base of the block where I've got some 333s, they're doing really well, and I'm very happy with them this year. Where else is getting very little rainfall? Well, the Nambucca area, where some macadamias are grown, has only had 582 mils so far this year. And Casino, which is out west of Lismore, typically lower rainfall, but it's really much lower this year. They're coming in at the bottom of the list at 451. So there's your range of rainfall in Australia, and you know, it will have implications for the crop. What we tend to find is that trees, if they've gone past the stage where they shed nuts, they'll try and hang on to them and bring them to full term, often with a thinner shell, but they'll still give you a decent kernel. Might be a bit smaller in terms of overall weight of the crop, but that's what happens when you don't have ideal conditions. And that brings me to the other subject of this video, because it'd be good to look a little bit further afield and see what's going on in the rest of the macadamia world. And thanks to the Australian Macadamia Society, they've brought back the details of the International Macadamia Symposium that was held in KwaZulu-Natal in September 2023. And what I found particularly interesting about the information they've fed back is that most of the major producing countries presented on what their industry was like, what their crops were like, the challenges they were currently facing. And it's absolutely fascinating info to go through. There's effectively 7 countries presented out of the top 9, and I've found some figures to sort of fill in the 2 that were missing, and the 2 that were missing were Vietnam and Hawaii. They didn't do a detailed presentation, but they are becoming, well, Hawaii's always been a substantial producer of nuts. They started the whole thing, and Vietnam is sort of up and coming. So here's a bit of a potted summary for you of the major macadamia producing countries in the world and how they reported that they're going. I'm going to count up from number 9. Brazil. Who would have thought Brazil was becoming a major player in the macadamia world? You might very well think, well, Brazil, you've got Brazil nuts. What do you want to worry about macadamias for? But not only are they worrying, they're actually doing research, and they're spending some money. I don't know if it's government or private money, but they're spending some money on making new varieties of their own, which a lot of the other countries aren't doing. They're sort of leaning heavily on Australia for new varieties. But Brazil is trying to develop its own varieties that are suitable to its growing area. There are problems with a lack of rainfall. I don't know whether that's a chronic lack of rainfall or whether that's just the current conditions. And they do have some high temperatures in parts of Brazil where macadamias are grown. And, you know, it's not a cold country in most places. It's very much an Amazonian country, which is why the Brazil nut thrives there, as well as in Peru and Bolivia. But interesting that they came in. They've got 8,000 hectares planted. They brought in the last season, 6,500 tonnes of nut in shell. Next up is, in between there is Vietnam, which didn't present, so we don't have any real details on the exact level of crop and what their current challenges are. So I can't really say much more other than Vietnam's in the mix. I think it's a fairly young industry and their production numbers should be going up, even if they're not planting more trees at the moment. Number 7, Malawi. Malawi's really interesting. It's a little bit north of Mozambique, and its nearest really advanced country is South Africa. And so Malawi leans on South Africa a lot for its processing and other services. But a lot of Malawi is really suited to macadamia production, which is interesting. You know, they've only got 42% of their trees at mature age. So there's a lot more to come from them, even if they don't plant another tree. But they're getting good returns. So out of 11,000 odd hectares, they've had 11,000 odd tonnes of nut. So that does suggest the country is a little bit more productive than some others. Next up, number 6 is Hawaii. Now, all we know about Hawaii is they're a very established macadamia country. From their government statistics, their crops were starting to increase again when the macadamia price was going up. So there is still an industry there. You wouldn't call it dormant because they're definitely putting out some numbers. I can't tell you the exact crop levels and the exact number of hectares planted because they didn't present at the seminar, but they're in there at number 6. Number 5, Guatemala. Now, Guatemala is interesting because, like the northern rivers of New South Wales, they have a lot of volcanic soil. It's good stuff. They also have plenty of rain because in some areas they're getting 6,000 millimetres a year, which is a bit more than a macadamia really needs and would present some issues, I suspect, with leaching of nutrients and stuff. But heck, it's certainly enough. There is some problems with topography because Guatemala is a fairly mountainous country from the volcanoes, but those challenges can usually be overcome. And there are also labour shortages there in Guatemala because so many of their population migrate off to the USA to find richer pickings. However, they've got 18,000 hectares under production and they're getting about 16,000 tonnes of nut at the moment, but they're only 45% at full production stage. So there's a lot of young trees there that are yet to bear fruit. And because it seems to be a reasonably productive place to grow macadamias, you can expect some big things from Guatemala going forwards. Right, number 4, Kenya. Kenya is actually a good country to grow macadamias and quite productive. It's a good growing climate. A lot of the country, so this is unlike some other countries, a lot of the country is suitable to growing macadamias. Its real problem in a way is that it's a very fragmented family industry where there aren't any big agribusinesses or aren't many big agribusinesses. So of the 31,000 hectares they've planted, they estimate more than 200,000 growers. So, there's lots of farms of well under 1 hectare of people growing, at most 100 macadamia trees and getting crops to contribute to collectives and that sort of thing. So it's an industry that might need to consolidate, although really there's some, that the country is a very populous country and large tracts of land aren't widely available. What we do know, though, is that as far as the raw ingredients for growing macadamias are concerned, it's a productive country. So of the 31,000 hectares they've planted, they got 41,000 tonnes of nuts, and that's a good statistic. Now, when you compare that with the number 3, which is China, bear in mind, Kenya produced 41,000 tonnes of nuts off 31,000 hectares. China barely beat Kenya, got about 42,000 tonnes of nuts. It did that on 309,000 hectares. Now, that's just about 10 times the amount of land to produce the same amount of nut. And look, the explanation in China is that the Chinese industry started largely as a poverty reduction scheme. So it was giving jobs to unemployed Chinese rural workers. Its aim, as you often find in communist countries, it wasn't trying to be the most efficient operation possible, and certainly if you're only getting 42,000 tonnes out of 300,000 hectares, it's a very unproductive enterprise. However, from sheer force and the sheer cheapness of labour costs, it can still actually remain competitive on that level. There are a few large-scale growers there. We don't know exactly how many growers there are over those 309,000 hectares, but there's a lot of small holdings as well. Macadamia consumption in China is still increasing. It's a very well-liked nut, so that's great. But some discerning consumers are looking for quality as well, and quality isn't too easy to come by when the farms aren't productive. Hold that thought for just a bit. Number 2, Australia. Yay. Believe it or not, we've got 41,000 hectares planted, and we've, from the last statistics, got 53,000 tonnes of nut. Now that's going off, I think, 2022 statistics. The final numbers have just come in for the 2022-23 season at about 48,000 tonnes, which the AMS said encouragingly was only 9% down on last season. So, 9% down on the season where everyone was washed out by flood? Well, look, there's silver linings on clouds and there's spin, and that's spin. But anyway, on our reported statistics, we had 53,000 tonnes of nut and shell on the 41,000 hectares. So we've got more tonnes of nut than we do in hectares, which is great. We have approximately 800 growers, so they still estimate the total number of macadamia farmers to be 800. And we do have the highest cost of production. So one of our biggest challenges, despite being an ideal, in most of our growing areas are good for growing macadamias, our challenges are rising farm input costs, rising farm labour costs, and obviously severe weather events. So the flood of 22, the El Nino of 23, although, it isn't really showing so far here. So that was interesting. And number 1, as I've mentioned a few times in earlier shows, number 1 is South Africa. They have 70-odd thousand hectares planted. About the same percentage are in full production. So we have about 65% of our plantings are fully producing. They have about 68% of their plantations fully producing. So we're looking really at 2 mature macadamia growing districts when you look at South Africa and Australia. They've really caught up now. There is, however, a lot of new plantings in the last 5 years for South Africa, and when they come online, you'd think if they're better varieties, they will start significantly outproducing Australia in terms of macadamia production. Not that different to Australia in terms of the number of growers. They're estimating they've got about 700 growers there, which is interesting. They are also confronted with increasing production costs. May not be increasing labour costs to the same extent, although there are input costs that they also share with Australia in terms of fertiliser costs, that sort of thing. Interestingly also, that as their industry matures, the local pests that live in South Africa start catching up with the idea of eating things on macadamia trees, and they're certainly seeing some stink bug, which is quite similar to our fruit spotting bug or the stink bugs you see on citrus trees in Australia. They're starting to become a much more prevalent pest, and so when you first start planting macadamias in an area and the pests haven't found them, that's a great honeymoon period. But eventually, given the ecosystem's ability to adjust, the pests will find the trees, and what local pests there are can really get in the way. So, and we've found that as Australian growing districts have matured, the pests come along with it, and it then becomes a balancing act of how you control those pests, and controlling pests costs money. So the ability to compete on price becomes reduced, I suppose, as the industry matures, because the free lunches kind of disappear. So that's a sort of rundown, but it was interesting, some general feedback at the symposium as well. Some of the areas that aren't that good for growing macadamias, the trees were giving nuts with kernel recoveries in the low teens and 20s. That is, the nuts were, in some cases, more than 80% shell with only a tiny nut in the middle. Now, a couple of things from that, obviously. You'll get very little usable crop if that's your kernel recovery amount, and you'll be spending most of the tree's energy on making shell and husk rather than nut, which means that it's not a very good conversion of fertiliser and those sorts of inputs into the outputs that you want. One of the correlations that they hinted at, but it didn't sort of go into in any degree, was where in equatorial climates the macadamia trees flower multiple times a year, the kernel recovery of the nuts suffers. That is, if it's putting on more than one crop a year, the tree just doesn't have enough energy to make nice, full, rich nuts full of macadamia oil, which is what you want. So I suppose in closing, I can curse all these weeds and grass and everything growing like topsy towards Christmas time, but it's towards Christmas time when everything is growing like topsy, including the macadamia nuts that you see on the trees here. And it's actually what you want, because this feverish growth period is what makes the nuts the best possible size. These aren't full size yet, but they'll get there. And the timing, particularly in the native environment for the macadamia, is obviously perfect, because that's how the species evolved. So, with somewhat of a begrudging smile, I'm going to get back to slashing. My old Kubota is doing beautifully well, despite having a faulty alternator at the moment, and I will get back and do some more of this, because I know that if I don't, it'll just be taller the next time I come back. Thankfully, it's a nice place to do it in. Bye for now, everyone. Stay well.